Looking for a thrill this summer? Vanessa Friedman will be here to talk about the best in thrillers for the summer. And if you're planning a trip or wishing you were, Liesl Schillinger will be here to talk about the latest in travel writing. Plus, we'll talk about what we're looking forward to reading this summer here at the Book Review. This is the Book Review podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. Vanessa Friedman joins us now to talk about the best thrillers of summer. Vanessa, thank you so much for being here.
Pamela, it's great to be with you.
All right. You reviewed 7 thrillers for us. The titles, I'm going to run through them quickly, and then we'll go back and talk about them. All the Lost Things by Michelle Sachs. Into the Jungle by Erica Fenichik. Beyond All Reasonable Doubt by Malin Persson Giolito. A Nearly Normal Family by M.T. Edverson. Paper Wasp by Lauren Akampura. Temper by Lane Fargo. And last but not least, because it's a big, huge, buzzy book, lots of anticipation for this one, Thomas Harris's Kari Mora. So a lot of fun thriller books. Let's start with the big one, Thomas Harris, author of Silence of the Lambs. How does this hold up? How does it compare?
Well, it's been 13 years, so people, I think, were really eager to find out what was next from him. And, you know, there's a monster in this one, but he's actually a relatively underplayed character. Mm-hmm. And in a way, I think it almost felt like he was a nod to the Harris fans. Like he felt like he had to give them some sort of crazy flesh-eating, he's really flesh-melting guy.
If not Hannibal Lecter, then someone
Then you get Hans-Peter Schmeidler, I think his name is.
That doesn't sound quite as terrifying, I have to say.
He's not, and he's actually ultimately a minor character. You know, Kari Mora, the woman in the title, is the protagonist, and she is a more physical and I think actually compelling woman than Clarice Starling. You know, she's got more self-confidence and more power, and, you know, it was a lot of fun to read.
What's it about?
So she is a Colombian refugee. So it's very topical because we're dealing with the issue of immigration and, you know, threats of deportation. And she is living in South Florida and working at a small animal refuge, as well as being a sort of a house sitter for a mansion on the coast, which was once owned by Pablo Escobar. And rumor has it is full of some hidden gold. And this becomes the kind of the crux on which a whole bunch of interested parties converge, and she gets sucked into that drive for various drug lords, gangsters, and other monsters to try and get the gold.
Does it feel like a Thomas Harris novel? Like for those who read the previous books, the Hannibal Lecter books, The Silence of the Lambs, and then its various prequels and sequels, does it feel like of a piece, or does it feel like a departure for Thomas Harris?
It feels like an evolution, which is a good thing.
Okay, so he's changed in 13 years.
He's moved on a bit.
All right. I want to talk about the next 2 books together because they are both translated from the Swedish, both by the same translator. His name is Rachel Wilson Broyles. The first is Beyond All Reasonable Doubt by Malin Persson Giolito. And then A Nearly Normal Family by M.T. Edverson. Are Swedish thrillers like the next thing? Is it like Nordic noir?
It's definitely not as gruesome as Nordic noir.
Okay. So this is no Joe Nesbo. This is not.
Blood.
Okay.
A lot less blood. They're both slightly antiseptic in tone, although I'm never quite sure if that's a function of the translation or simply like the way these authors write. One is a legal thriller. One is a semi-legal thriller, more of a family thriller.
A lawless thriller.
You know, and they both turn on really the question of how well we know the people around us, how much we really understand about motivation, and they're pretty compelling to read.
Okay, so let's talk about A Nearly Normal Family. That is the not quite legal thriller. What's that about?
So there's a 17-year-old daughter of a minister and his lawyer wife who has been convicted of a murder. And as parents, they're, of course, incredibly torn about the idea that their child could ever do something like that. And it is a kind of Rashomon telling so that each member of the family explains their version of what happened. And, you know, I think the daughter is by far the most interesting, complicated, and multi-layered character. The father's a little whiny, gets a little annoying, spends a lot of time wrestling with the questions of, you know, what does God tell him versus what is his obligation to his family. The mother is much more cut and dried and, you know, all about defending in court her child. And then we find out whether or not the child actually did it.
All right, let's move to our other Swedish import, which is very much a legal thriller, Beyond All Reasonable Doubt by Malin Persson-Giolito. What's the premise of this book?
So Sophia Webster is the lawyer in question here. She has been called in to defend a convicted murderer who has been in jail for a very long time because one of her old law professors has gone through the evidence and decided he did not have a fair trial originally. Now, a lot of the impetus behind his conviction was actually public opinion because there were many rumors at the time, and he's kind of a jerk. He's arrogant, he's off-putting, he doesn't look like he's wrestling with any sort of moral issue. And people there were all these rumors saying that he had abused his young child. That was never proven, but everyone decided he was just a bad guy. So the question for Sophia, as much as whether or not he actually did anything, is it right to remove this person from society because he's a bad guy, whether or not he actually is guilty of the specific crime he committed?
When it comes to things Scandinavian, one of the questions I always wonder about, whether it's a book or a TV show or a movie, is like, do I get to feel like I'm in Scandinavia where everything is better? Do I get a sense of the place? I don't know. Like, do these feel somehow like inherently Swedish, or are they very much kind of international crossover and you could just dip into it?
Well, I think you can definitely dip into it because the actual plot lines are completely universal. However, I think part of that antiseptic feeling is actually a question of place and setting, in the same way that like design in Sweden and homewares in Sweden are very minimal and sort of blonde wood and clean. The prose is also very minimal and kind of clean.
So if you like that sort of that Danish housewares, pared down, minimalist look, you will like this kind of thriller, perhaps. Okay, this does not look at all antiseptic. Into the Jungle by Erika Ferencik, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, because the line on the cover says, "It will swallow you whole." ... How is this? What's this about?
Is like erupting with the greenery and the plant life and the foliage and the animals in the Bolivian jungle, and it is really heavy.
Is it good?
Yeah, it is good. It's about a girl who comes from the American foster care system, ends up in Bolivia because she's chasing a job, there meets a guy, falls in love, and ends up moving to the jungle, to his village with him because a panther has eaten his young nephew.
As they do.
And they're gonna go hunting for it. And and she essentially becomes, or tries to become, a part of his tribe. And, that doesn't always go so well. One of the ironies of reading this book is actually the depiction of place. The poisonous frogs and the flesh-eating parasites and the water snakes is so much richer and more terrifying than the actual people involved that, when you get to the mystery itself, the kind of the theoretic plot twist, you kind of just want it to go away and want to hear more about the frogs.
All right, let's get back to the frogs of Bolivia. What about All the Lost Things with Michelle Sachs? That looks a little bit more domestic.
It's going to be very familiar to anyone who read Emma Donohue's Room. The main character is a 7-year-old girl. She's been taken on a road trip by her father, and so she's essentially trapped in a small car. And she speaks, much as the protagonist did in that book, in selected capital letters, which is something that's done for emphasis and the kind of depiction of a child's voice, but it can be a little irritating until you get, sort of give yourself over to it. And then she's actually quite a charming child, and it becomes a very emotional book.
The other two books are also set in the U.S., Paper Wasp by Lauren Acampora. Tell us about that book.
So that one's a Hollywood noir, although it starts in Michigan. And it features two high school classmates who were best friends, grew apart. One went off to Hollywood, became a starlet. One stayed where she was, and her world got smaller and smaller and smaller because she turns out to be somewhat unstable personality. And they re-meet during a high school reunion, and the unstable one, Abby, is invited to go visit her friend, and in the kind of throwaway invitation that one does during a high school reunion, and she takes it seriously. Off she goes and becomes essentially a fantasist stalker and ends up really taking over her friend's life.
And then the last one is Temper by Lene Fargo. This takes place in Chicago. What's it about?
The experimental theater world in Chicago. And again, it's about a would-be actress who gets sucked into the thrall of a conceptual director/actor, and he attempts to mold her into whatever his idea of his leading lady is, with the expected negative results.
What was your favorite among these 7 thrillers?
Probably Into the Jungle, I think. Into the Jungle and the Sophia Webster book.
You read a lot of thrillers, and I don't know what your sort of bar is like. Like, what is your standard? I mean, is it that something that just is doing something different or something that maybe is predictable but does it so well? What do you consider a good
I want
thriller?
something to suck me in, you know, to even if I see something coming, even if you know where it's going, you can't really stop reading it. And that's often a function of the prose and the characters and the atmosphere that's created. And to me, that's what you want. You know, you want a story that really carries you along. And, you know, ideally at the end, you'd like a surprise, but even if you don't get a surprise, you feel somewhat satisfied by the fact that you couldn't put it down.
So some of our listeners might be thinking to themselves, I know the name Vanessa Friedman. I know the name Vanessa Friedman. And it's not just because you occasionally write thriller reviews for us and other reviews of books, but also because perhaps you're the fashion director here at the Times and our chief fashion critic. And so I can't help but ask, it's quite clear that you have a critical eye from the way you talk about these books. How does fashion criticism differ from literary criticism? And I don't know, are there any surprising ways in which it's very much a similar enterprise?
When I'm thinking about fashion, I'm really thinking about the role of image in the public eye and how people are trying to manipulate other people's impressions of them, you know, how to manipulate opinion and how to communicate. And books are essentially a means of communication. And an author is always trying to manipulate your understanding and your perception. So I think, you know, on that level, they're very similar.
You also have to do a lot of travel for your fashion writing, often going back and forth to shows. Are thrillers a go-to genre for you in terms of just I'm assuming you're on the plane a lot?
It's essentially a brain cleanse for me. You know, if you spend all day looking at skirts and dresses and trying to figure out what this is saying about, you know, women's lives in that moment, the opportunity to escape into a book, you know, that you can pick up and put down, which is also important, you know, and go into a really different world is pretty valuable.
All right. Well, that's a lot less gruesome than what I was imagining you might say, which is like you can't help wonder, like, if they were brutally slaughtered in that dress, what would it look like? All right, Vanessa, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Vanessa Friedman is our chief fashion critic at the Times and the fashion director of the New York Times, and she also reviewed thrillers for this week's summer reading issue. Joining us now from Washington, Elizabeth Flock, who is my partner over at the PBS NewsHour for the Now Read This book club. Liz, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So to our podcast listeners who may not be familiar with this, Now Read This is a book club now in its second year in which the New York Times Book Review, together with PBS NewsHour, chooses a book. It can be fiction, it can be nonfiction, it can be new, it can be old, that we think somehow captures the conversation that's going on in the news or in our culture today. And Liz, who works together with Jeffrey Brown, our other partner over at PBS NewsHour, together with editors here at the Book Review, helps choose the books and then leads the book club members through a conversation on Facebook and then on the PBS NewsHour at the end of each month. And Liz this week joins us to talk a little bit about how we pick our books and why and what our next book is for the month of June. So Liz, from your end, tell us what you all are looking for in a book selection.
Every month we're looking for merit. It's about the book itself. It's about the author. And it's also about books that matter now. When we started this book club, we said that it was going to be about books that help us make sense of the times that we're living in. So we really want it to feel relevant and almost driven by the news and the current conversation to help people make sense of those things.
Right. And like all book club picks, you kind of have to have something in there, some meat that really merits conversation, discussion, debate.
Oh, absolutely. Conversation and also sort of an immersive reading experience, I think. We want people to really be active on the Facebook page, talking about it, debating, asking each other questions, trying to figure out things together.
And also, people can contribute their own questions for the author when they are interviewed by Jeffrey Brown on air on the NewsHour.
Yeah, every month we solicit reader questions. People record videos of themselves asking the questions, and then those questions are posed directly to the author, which the author then answers on television.
All right, so we're going to do something exciting, which is announce the next book here on the
Yay.
podcast, which will be a bit simultaneous with the news hour. Last month, we read Daniel Mendelssohn's An Odyssey, a memoir. And this month, we are going with, drumroll, Liz.
We are reading N.K. Jemison's fantasy novel, The Fifth Season.
So why did we decide on this book?
Well, I think it is really about the book itself. This is a tremendous, complicated, immersive book. It won the Hugo Award in 2016, the highest honor for science fiction. She's the first female Black author to win, and now she's won 3 times.
In a row
For the trilogy. And actually, this book is the first in a trilogy, but I'll say you don't necessarily need to read all 3, although I did, after I finished, find myself wanting to continue. And this book is very timely. You know, it takes place in a world not our own, but I think its premise is very timely, which is that in the 5th season, the world is sort of menaced by constant environmental catastrophe, and its inhabitants are struggling to figure out how to make their way in that world.
It's a very nice pick for June because we wanted something that felt summery in a way, like a big engrossing novel that you could get into. But we'd also, I think on both of our ends, been thinking a lot about the environment and in trying to get a novel that sort of touched on that more directly, even if not going with a kind of nonfiction book about climate change.
Right. And as you're reading this, it's speculative fiction, but you're thinking the entire time, this is what our world could look like if humans don't address some of like the very pressing problems of today. And so you're reading it and you're engrossed and there's world building and you're getting attached to the characters, but at the same time, there's this sort of thing happening at the back of your mind where you're constantly anxious at the same time. And it was just made for a really interesting reading experience.
And longtime listeners of the podcast will remember that Nora N.K. Jemison has been a guest on this podcast talking about her work, and also that she is the former and was the first otherworldly columnist for the book review. She reviewed science fiction and fantasy novels for us for several years before handing over the reins. I think she is now full-time immersed in novel writing and in screen adaptations of her work. But we're very excited to see her on the NewsHour and to talk about her new book. So, Liz, thanks so much again for joining us.
Thanks so much.
Elizabeth Flock is an arts and books producer at PBS NewsHour. Liesl Schillinger joins us now to talk about the best travel writing for summer reading. Liesl, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So for those who are not familiar with our summer reading travel roundup, I can speak a little bit from direct experience because I used to write this myself when I was a freelancer for our mutual editor, now my colleague Elida Becker. And I find this to be such a fun project because Elida will send you like huge boxes of travel books, and then you get to kind of sift among them and choose which ones you want to review, which I always found extremely fun rather than sort of have to review something.
Well, there are 24 or 30 of them. I mean, there are so many. But for anyone who's a real armchair traveler, as well as a, air and sea traveler, it's so exciting to hold in your hand all these different places you could go. And always cities and places, islands come to mind that I hadn't thought about. And I just get so engrossed. And the problem is actually weeding them out.
I mean, the way that I did it, and I'm curious how you did it, but the way I thought about it was that I didn't pick and choose necessarily the best, because you can always review things negatively, which is fun and necessary often. But to try to find some kind of cohesive or coherent narrative, some kind of arc that sort of ties them together, that might say something about travel in our times or a certain aspect of travel or an aspect of travel writing. What do you do?
I do exactly the same thing. I look for some unifying principle, something that ties them together. I look at these books as stepping stones to each other, and after I've looked at enough of them, I begin to sort of see the trajectory they can make together. And in this one, so many of the authors departed from wildly different points of knowledge about the trips they were, or the places they were writing about, that I kind of thought, okay, what do you need to know to embark on the adventure that each one of these books suggests? And that was kind of how I did it. And I began with people who just didn't know a thing. They were just blindly, just a shot in the dark, getting on a boat that they'd bought without even seeing it,
Yeah.
going they knew not where.
I mean, I always find that a very interesting divide in terms of travel writing. You can have the kind of person who's sort of the idiot who steps into a situation they know nothing about, the sort of Redmond O'Hanlon into the heart of Borneo, like here I am in the jungle.
Love him. Yeah.
I love him too. Or you can have the, I've been studying Egypt my entire life, and here I am specifically going to this teeny corner of Egypt, the one teeny place of, part of Egypt that I haven't been, to find out about this one small sliver.
I like both the absolute beginners who just kind of plunged into the pool and started flailing, and the people who are deeply involved, whether it's intellectually or through their travels or through some family background that pops up. I like it all. One travel writer I was thinking of that I really like is James Fenton.
Oh, yeah.
He wrote a book called Bad Trips, and see, that also weaves politics into it. And
Well,
a
James
lot of
Fenton was the accompanied Redmond O'Hanlon
often
on those trips that Redmond wrote about.
Yeah, I think I first discovered both of them in Granta decades ago, but then got their books just because I really like two kinds of travel writing. One is the people who don't pretend they're sophisticated and knew everything to begin with. The people who don't pretend you shouldn't be shocked when somebody gives you, boiled goat's heads with eyeballs sort of rolling around. The people who sort of say, wow, this took me aback. Then explain. I like it when they draw you into the surprises and don't pretend sophistication. But then I also do like the people who know so much about something and artfully weave their knowledge into it in a way that makes the landscape come alive. Because you just do need to know about some places before you land, I think.
What do you think about the complainers? The sort of Paul Theroux model of the, you go somewhere and everyone is despicable in some way or annoying or not good enough.
Well, actually, I'm trying to remember which of these authors mentioned Paul Theroux lovingly in their book this time around. A little of it goes a long way. If I don't feel they're just being hectoring and first world and privileged, if I actually think that they were under duress and it's amusing to share in their miseries, then I like it.
Yeah, I know.
But
a little complaining can be fun, right?
A little bit of Basil Fawlty is fun, particularly when they're writing about the restaurants.
I'm going to run through the titles. And first I should say, Liesl, that you did this was like a Herculean task. You not only got about 24 books, but you chose half of them. So
particularly the Augean Stables.
Yes. I have 10 books in front of me, but I think you actually reviewed 12 books.
I think you don't have Pagan Light there, which was one of my favorites.
Pagan Light by?
Jamie James.
Okay, so we'll talk about Pagan Light, but I'm going to run through the rest of the titles just so people know what they're in for. The books that Liesl reviewed this week for our travel roundup include Seven at Sea, Why a New York City Family Cast Off Convention for a Life-Changing Year on a Sailboat by Eric Orton and Emily Orton. That's sounding intriguing. Ottoman Odyssey, Travels Through a Lost Empire by Liesl Scott.
She's an amazing young woman. She studied classics at Oxford, and then she went to Bosphorus University in Istanbul to teach Latin, became a political reporter for The Guardian, and this is her second book, and she is part Turkish. Her mother is Turkish Cypriot.
It's an interesting time, too, to be writing about Turkey.
It's a fascinating time, but she got in trouble for writing so much about the crackdown on freedom of speech and on reporters by Erdogan that they actually canceled her visa. And in the book, she's so crushed because she's gone to make a pilgrimage to see Ataturk's childhood home in Thessaloniki, which used to be called Salonika. The Turkish Empire and the Greeks, they kind of mesh uncomfortably over the centuries.
When you take the train to go to Thessaloniki from Turkey, you have different railroad systems, and it's like this incredibly arduous train transfer because the
flags
are
change
deliberately
in the middle of the bridge. Yeah, my brother did that. I haven't made that trip. It's similar also when you're going on the Trans-Siberian to the Trans-Mongolian Railroad. You have to wait for the trains to be lifted onto wheels of a different gauge because that's done so that people can't just invade by rail. But anyway, back to the question of Thessaloniki and Liesl Scott. So she was going back to Istanbul where she'd been living for years, and they said, no, you can't come back. Your visa privileges have been revoked. And so nonetheless, she's got to get back to her native Turkey or her half-native Turkey. So she goes to Larnaca, which is a Greek city on the Turkish-Greek split island of Cyprus. And then she makes it overland up to northern Cyprus, which is Turkish. But then she talks about the paradoxes of these differences of people who have so much in common. And it's just fascinating reading her travels in that book to see how, Turkey was a caliphate that spread across many, many continents for centuries. And if you go to what used to be Yugoslavia now, Erdogan's government, for a decade, they've been rebuilding mosques and whirling dervish lodges and funding universities. And she said you could compare it to if the Italian government had started restoring Roman ruins across Europe. So it's really amazing to have her eye to see this vine of Turkishness spreading into leaf.
So this travels through a lost empire. Her subtitle of Ottoman Odyssey really is empire in the old sense of the word. It's Turkey extending beyond the borders.
She travels through the Levant. She goes to Turkey. She goes to Israel. She goes to Bosnia. And she meets an Erdogan fanboy who has pennants all over his backyard with Turkish colors. And, it's amazing to sort of see the patriotism, the Turkish boosterism that she finds.
All right, let's skip on to the other titles, and then we'll come back and go into each a little bit more in detail. The Salt Path by Rainer Wynn. Lotharingia, which, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, A Personal History of Europe's Lost Country by Simon Winder. See You in Piazza by Frances Mays. There is a familiar name. The subtitle of that is New Places to Discover in Italy. John Van Sothen's Monsieur Mediocre, One American Learns the High Art of Being Everyday French. Okay, we can tell, I think, which school that falls into. And then another Francophile title, John Baxter's A Year in Paris, Season by Season in the City of Light. Kristen Knight Pace's This Much Country. In Putin's Footsteps, Searching for the Soul of an Empire Across Russia's 11 Time Zones by Nina Khrushcheva. I think
Khrushcheva is how it's pronounced.
Is that? But she is the granddaughter of Khrushchev?
A granddaughter. Nikita Khrushchev. Mm-hmm.
Wow. And Jeffrey Taylor. And then Off the Rails, A Train Trip Through Life by Beppe Severnini.
And there's one other book I think you haven't mentioned, Volcanoes, Palm Trees, and Privilege, Essays on Hawaii by Liz Prato, an Oregonian who in her soul wishes she could be a true islander.
Well, let's start there, because Hawaii sounds like a nice place to start.
Well, it does, but this book is very interesting. It's very much a creature of our time. She loves Hawaii. She went there as a 12-year-old right before her parents got divorced. And then she started going back many times with her father, who was maybe doing something with real estate there. But it's where she came of age. And she weaves it into a famous Brady Bunch story of the family going there. She's very concerned about white Americans trying to appropriate Hawaiian culture. And one thing is that she uses Hawaii. She uses that, it looks like an apostrophe, but it's called an okina. And so she talks about how emotionally she related to this island, how much she loves it, but she really defends its right to its own heritage apart from what tourists, even well-meaning tourists like her, want to make of it.
That's interesting. Does the issue of cultural appropriation sort of permeate any of these books, any of these other ones?
I stepping stoned that one with a fascinating book on the island of Capri called Pagan Light by Jamie James. And see, Capri is a little island about 20 miles across the Bay of Naples, which was first colonized by the Emperor Augustus. When he was old, he just sort of went and had an island retreat there. But then his successor, Tiberius, the Emperor Tiberius, built like 12 different palaces on that island. But then the historians, Suetonius and Tacitus, accused him of vile, sadistic, gross sexual acts, and the island was like covered in infamy. And famous French serial killer named Gilles de Rais copied the things that Tiberius may actually not have done. But anyway, so if you've heard of Capri, all you think is the Blue Grotto, you think of Audrey Hepburn and her
think
Capris.
Of Contempt.
You think of Brigitte Bardot. And there's this amazing house that was built on the island of Capri. I'm trying to remember the name of the architect. It's called the Casa Malaparte. It was built by the fascist, later Maoist author Curzio Malaparte. But anyway, it's a boxy, strange house on this hillside overlooking the Bay of Naples. But anyway, more interesting is, for the purposes of this book, Jamie James has found linked together the rich biographies of great artists and writers. Somerset Maugham lived there with, I think it was one of his lovers, E.F. Benton, the man who wrote Map and Lucia. Oscar Wilde and Bosie came there after Oscar Wilde had been to jail, but he was kind of shunned because of class violations. The lesbian painter Romaine Brooks had a house there. Gorky was exiled there, which the Russians thought was a joke because exiled in paradise.
Yeah, seriously.
And Lenin came and hung out with him. So basically, the more you read this book, the more I just thought of the Piazzetta, and I thought of Shirley Hazard, whom he glancingly mentions. But the real history of this island is in the 19th and early 20th centuries is gifted renegades, people who are outsiders who came in and kind of brought their creative vision and their separateness to this island, and it was their refuge. So I want to go to Capri and visit these gorgeous villas they built. And my favorite is a French turn-of-the-century poet and a writer named Fersen. It was a made-up name. A lot of them had made-up names. He was shamed in Paris right before he married someone because he staged these tableaux vivants where young boys would be nude, draped in silken, like, gold taffeta, diaphanous wraps, and they'd be lying on bearskins covered in lilies enacting classical scenes. And the Paris tabloids made hay of that, and his engagement was broken, and he fled to Capri. So a lot of the people have stories like that.
All right, I want to go from there. So we're going from Hawaii to Capri to another place on the sea, although very different, the southwest coast of England with The Salt Path by Raynor Winn, because you said this was also one of the books that you especially liked.
I was very moved by this book. I was surprised by it. It's a true story. The author, Raynor Winn, Ray Winn, and her husband, Moth, were about 50-51. And in one day, they lost their house, which is a farmhouse. They used it also as a rental. And it was a business deal through a friend that they lost. It was a bad speculation that got them in trouble. The next day, they found out that Moth had a terminal illness. They were turfed out of their house, and they didn't want to be a burden on their kids, who were only about 20. So they thought of this book called 500 Mile Walkies, about a man who walked the Southwest Coast Path, which goes from Somerset down to Dorset. They had 2 backpacks on their backs. They had no money. They had a little tent. But as they walk through this rugged landscape, they're really touching. It reminds me of the beautiful novel by Kazuo Ishiguro, The Buried Giant, because it's this couple, and they feel more elderly than they are, but they're in the elements, walking through this kind of mythic landscape, and strange things happen to them. A soothsayer comes up and says, your journey will end when you walk with a turtle. And they're like, what? But so they're having a rough time. They have no money, and it's a moving journey, and it's an odyssey. They get back home, and I'm assuming that this book raised them out of their distress, but it's a quite amazing story of a journey in flight from adversity that brought them home.
Let's go to something that seems like it's been written before many, many times. This book about France, the most recent one, or probably not the most recent one, but you think of Me Talk Pretty One Day by David Sedaris. This one is called Monsieur Mediocre, One American Learns the High Art of Being Everyday French by John Van Southen.
It's very funny. He definitely presents himself as an absolute beginner, but there wasn't enough space to give some of the different angles and depths of this book in my little write-up. But he was a 30-year-old man, just about to turn 30, in Brooklyn, when he fell in love with this gorgeous, cool French woman who was working as a waitress in a bistro. Her name is Anaïs, and she was very scornful, and he was completely smitten. And I kind of think of her as La Femme Nikita, but her name was Anaïs. He follows her to Paris. They decide to have a baby, but you see him reacting in astonishment to French cultural expectations. But you also learn the backstory, which is his parents were Eisenhower Republicans, and they were in their 40s when they had him. He grew up in Georgetown, and his mother had had a year in Paris after, I think it was Vassar, and she had always told him, instead of bedtime stories, she told him about her adventures in France. And so he was really steeped from his earliest childhood in this idea of seeking France as a kind of liberation. And after that year, she ended up working for Air France so she could see the world and travel. But so, he got to finish the story that she had only tasted. He's gotten to live it. And so it's moving, seeing that this is a bigger family story, even the story of his family with Anaïs and their 2 kids.
So here we come to yet another kind of 2 categories of travel books. One is where you drop in and leave. And then this kind, the second kind, the Peter Mails kind of where you go and you stay. That's what he's done here in Monsieur Mediocre. He lives there in France now?
They live in Paris. They found a disused spice warehouse and they converted it into a big old loft. And the French think they're crazy, but also think they're cool. And they live in an edgy neighborhood, the 10e arrondissement, and that's pretty much that's where Bataclan happened a few years ago. But they also managed to get, a country place just because if you live in a foreign country, you basically take on the habits of the people around you. So, yeah, it's almost like that Ray Bradbury story, Dark They Were with Golden Eyes. He's slowly turning into being like the French people who surround him.
All right, well, I'm going to pass over then John Baxter's A Year in Paris, which people can read about in your roundup, and skip over to this intriguing book we mentioned earlier. I think intriguing to me because of the name of the author. I'm not going to try to pronounce it again.
Nina Khrushcheva.
Nina Khrushcheva, a granddaughter of Nikita Khrushchev, and Jeffrey Taylor, and their book is called In Putin's Footsteps, Searching for the Soul of an Empire Across Russia's 11 Time Zones. Let's start with those time zones.
It's actually, they point out, if you look at Greenwich Mean Time, more fairly it would be 7, but the Russians have kept it 11 because they're so proud to be so expansive. The Russian mindset, a mystery wrapped in an enigma, isn't that what Churchill said? Let's not go there. But what she does is unscramble, decode some of the mysteries we all have about Putin's Russia. Americans don't like to believe that Putin is as popular as polls show, but he is. And he certainly has massive detractors, and there's been massive rallies against his abuses of power. But she starts in Kaliningrad in the west and goes all the way east to Kamchatka, that past Vladivostok. And she visits in these cities. And I was really shocked to see that in every town she went, someone would stop her and say, Krim nash, Crimea is ours, like they were proud that Putin had annexed it. And in the town squares, she would see the double-headed Romanov eagle, which is a Tsarist symbol, which has been brought back. It was out of favor during the communist period, but she shows an empire that is trying to reassert itself. And she finds people who are still poor, people who have made money. But I really liked her and Jeffrey's focus on some cities that I'd never seen written about, like Perm. I didn't know that's where Dr. Zhivago and the Three Sisters were both set. And the town of Yakutsk has a woolly mammoth museum. And at Vladivostok, I guess they're trying to rebrand that as the San Francisco of Russia. They're building 3 bridges there, including one called the Golden Bridge. She really branches out, and they branch out, I should say, going mostly along the southern extent, along the Trans-Siberian Railroad, although they have to drive far off route to get to these towns. But they show how it's connected. And I think her expression was that it showed a kind of split personality. She thought that the double-headed eagle was a pretty good sign of some of the confusions that she thinks divide the Russian soul.
Let's end where we started and where we are now with this book, 7 at Sea, Why a New York City Family Cast Off Convention for a Life-Changing Year on a Sailboat by Eric Orton and Emily Orton. I mean, this is also kind of not a new thing. I feel like there's been a number of books in recent years where people have up and gone with their family around the world and discovered many things about those places and themselves along the way. Where does this book fall into that category?
This book grabbed me because one of my earliest reading experiences as a kid was reading the Swiss Family Robinson and seeing how they made isinglass. They caught certain fish so they could make window-like substances, and they caught a peccary and found a way to get the skin off of it so they could eat it. It's showing how they survived in this weird circumstance. And then I also, I read the Odyssey later, and Homer actually gives descriptions of how Odysseus made his raft. And then later I read Kon-Tiki by Thor Heyerdahl, which they actually mention in this book too, where he describes how he makes his seagoing raft. But you see how they do it. And I think a lot of us want to know, what would be the practical steps you would take? How do you divorce from your Manhattan day job? How do you afford this? How do you run this boat? What do you do when suddenly the water pipe isn't working or when the engine sputters? And so I just thought it was kind of fascinating just to see how they made it work. This isn't so much where they go as how they got there and how they are coping on board with the challenges that they face as a novice seafarers, but also as a family that's trying to, I guess, tighten their bonds and add context and texture to their bonds while they're in this strange circumstance.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine where you would go if your brother's driving you crazy or if you just need to be alone for a while.
One of the great things is they do encounter every now and then a similar yacht of people like them, and they call them kid boats. And they'll actually moor for a couple of days so that the kids can, get in the dinghies and go and see each other and get a little time away from the parents.
Okay, so quick shorthand for those looking to do a little bit of armchair travel reading this summer. Which books were your favorites among these that you reviewed?
My favorites were the Capri book. I want to go to Capri. I want to see the remnants of the Villa Jovis built by Tiberius, and I want to see the Villa Lysis by the weird, scandalous French baron and poet Fersen. And I actually want to glide through the Blue Grotto.
That book is called?
That book is called Pagan Light. And that's by Jamie James. It just fascinated me.
So it's the kind of travel book that actually makes you want to go to the place it's talking about.
Right.
Another category.
And we didn't talk too much about See You in the Piazza by Frances Mays, but that's a very good book for someone who's already been to Italy and wants to know more places to go. Mm-hmm. I really want to go to Alto Adige. I want to go to this northern alpine meadow place that she visits and also eat the strange Germanic food that she eats. She gives recipes in each of these chapters. But she also understands that people can't cook that well, so she gives you cheats and shortcuts. That was useful. The Putin's Footsteps book really drew me because I lived in Russia for a while. I'm a bit of a Slavophile. I teach a bit about that. I want to go to Perm. I want to go to Yakutsk. The book made me think I didn't want to go to Irkutsk. I probably don't want to go to Blagoveshchensk, a strange city she mentioned that's 500 meters across the Amur from Russia to China. So it's literally China is where Brooklyn is in New York. If you're in the Manhattan side, you can literally see China just across. I want to see that. I didn't mention the Iditarod book. I'd always wanted to know what it'd be like to mush sled dogs. And this woman, Kristen Knight Pace, wrote a book called This Much Country. And if you've ever wondered how that would work, you might want to read that. And the Lotharingia book, he mentions one particular village in the Netherlands that used to be in Belgium called Sehertenbosch or something like that. It's very hard to pronounce.
So was this a principality? Was this an actual country? What was Lotharingia?
Lotharingia still exists. It actually means Lorraine, like quiche Lorraine, but it's Belgium, it's France, it's Luxembourg, it's not Liechtenstein, or is it? It's Germany, but only west of the Rhine, I think. It's very confusing. He writes in a jokey way of how hard it is to understand what parts he means. But I want to visit Sehertenbosch, if I'm saying that right, which I'm probably not, which is the village where Hieronymus Bosch lived. And there's a very funky, weird cathedral where they've got devil and dragon statuary. I want to see the funky cathedral, and I want to see Hieronymus Bosch's village.
Well, now I think all of us do, too. So, Liesl, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Pamela.
Liesl Schillinger wrote our travel roundup this week in our summer reading issue of the Book Review. Joining us now, my colleagues Jumana Khatib, Sarah Lyle, and Concepcion de Leon. Hi, guys.
Hi.
Thanks for being here. So we are actually going to do something different this week. We're not going to talk about what we reviewed or what we read, but what we would like to read for the summer. So we will talk in light ignorance of books that we have yet to read, although perhaps we have read and want to reread, and kind of what we like to read during the summer. And I'm going to start with Jumana. What are you planning to or hoping to read this summer?
Oh, well, I think I realized pretty early on that my greatest chance for a summer fling would be to read one writer all summer. So
you're going to go study with a writer?
I'm going to go study with Muriel Spark this summer,
Oh my God,
I think.
good person to date.
I know. I hope she calls me back. So I have never read The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, but everybody I love loves that book, and I can't wait to read it. Right now, I'm sort of dipping my toe in with A Far Cry from Kensington, and my plan is, to stick with her all summer and get through as many novels of hers as I can.
One of the many things that I love about bookstores in England is they have things like entire setup displays that'll be all reissues of Muriel Spark.
Yeah.
Our executive editor, Dean Baquet, is a Muriel Spark fan.
Oh, is he?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you can
Are you
discuss
not
your
going to
books
read
with him.
anything else? I mean, that's your plan? You'll
Oh,
be
no,
faithful
no.
all summer?
Well, I don't know if Muriel will know this. I mean, I'm somebody that has a lot of books going all at once, but I like having that project, and I like having that time to sort of like luxuriate in somebody's body of work.
So you'll be having a relationship with her, but cheating on her with these other authors at the same time.
Not cheating. I like to think of this more as
An open relationship.
I mean, cheat is a strong word. I think
Play
she'll be
around.
open to it. Play around. I'm still working out the details. Anyway, Sarah, what are you going to be reading this summer?
Well, I'm going to start with someone I'm only slightly acquainted with, who's Patrick Radden Keefe, who, if you've all read his amazing piece in the New Yorker a couple years ago about the IRA and a unsolved mystery from Northern Ireland at the time of the Troubles. And he's produced a book called Say Nothing, which is a book-long expansion of that incredible piece. And it's like all these things that are beyond what they are. It sounds, from the reviews I've read, like a literary mystery and a historical mystery and an incredible feat of storytelling. And it happens to be a period I've been a little scared to dig too deep in because it's so upsetting. But at a time when there's so much uncertainty, and there was so much uncertainty then about the reality and the truth of what was happening, his seeming enterprise in digging down and finding as much truth as he could sounds so admirable and interesting, and I love the way he writes. And then, since it's going to be a little bit nonfiction for me this summer, because I feel I've been too sloppy with escapist fiction in the last few months, I'm going to reread my friend Lauren Collins's book, When in French, which is such a great book. And when I read it, the first time I read it way too fast, and she's such a good writer. She also writes for The New Yorker, and this is a sort of memoir about learning a whole new language because of marrying someone who that's his first language. So she's American, she married a French person and took French lessons. And it's a really great meditation on the importance of language and how language reflects culture. And it has one of my very favorite passages from recent years in it, which is something like, she's talking about how in the United States in America, in English, there's so much tendency toward hyperbole and sort of effusion, and it's kind of sloppy. And she's saying, like, for example, I love barbecue. I love that top. I love getting on the metro early in the morning, on. And my husband has only ever loved me. And I think it's so beautiful. So I want to reread that.
I have to ask, Sarah, because this book came up in conversation at lunch. Was that what inspired this rereading project?
Yes, because so often, you read books, especially novels, I think, that you read because you want to find out what happens and you don't read them carefully enough. And then you go back and you realize you remember how beautiful the language is, and you read it really slowly because you're so excited by the sentences. And I think she's such a beautiful stylist and so kind of clever, and I love her wry nature. And, she's one of those people, no matter what she wrote about, if she wrote about her year watching the paint dry and how it affected her, I'd be into it.
Yeah, she's also good on Twitter.
Really funny on
Yes.
Twitter, yeah.
Funny and biting and wry there, too. Concepcion, what about you? What are you planning to read?
I think that something that is sort of left over from my schoolgirl days is that I think
Which
of
was
the
like
summer-
last year, right?
Yeah, obviously like last month. So I still think of the summer as this like time where I have loads of time and I can just I can just dig into things. And so it's the time that I use to really catch up on a whole bunch of books that I felt like I was too busy like during the year, even though nothing changes. I'm still coming to work.
I'm still like that too, Concepcion,
Right?
if it's any consolation. Oh, yeah. No, I
I feel like
imagine
it
that
never
like
goes
summer
away.
is going to be a break. And of course,
Well, that's what's so interesting about
absolutely
this
The
notion
opposite.
of
Yeah.
summer
Most of the
reading.
time,
totally.
Like, what is summer reading when you don't really have a summer because you have a job?
Yes.
What does that mean to
I mean,
us?
I think that there is some sliver, some other demographic, some earlier bit of maybe more of the magazine side of journalism than the newspaper side that like would have summer Fridays and like go out to the Hamptons. I've never been part of that particular slice of America. So like for me, it's just the same old, same old.
Oh, I used to have summer Fridays. It was really nice.
Back in the day.
I love it here too, though.
Well, you have to say that on this podcast. But what will you read during these supposed long hours off you have?
So I have 3 books in in front of me. One I'm really excited about. It's The Dreamers by Karen Thompson Walker. And I think I've only gotten through maybe 20 pages of it, but it's essentially about an epidemic in this small, I guess, college town in which the women start to kind of fall asleep and never wake up. And I don't know what's going to happen yet. I don't know where it comes from. But the reason that I was really excited about it was because it got a blurb from Emily St. John Mandel, who wrote Station 11, which is one of my favorite books of the last 4 years. And I just love dystopian novels. They're so fun to me. So I'm really excited about that.
I love the end of the world. It's so much fun.
It's so fun. I just like to plan ahead and know what's coming. And then I'm also really excited about this book of essays called The Good Immigrant that came out, I think, a couple of months ago. And it's just 26 different writers that are from different immigrant backgrounds from all over the world writing about their experience of immigrating to America. And that one I'm really excited about because I actually read a couple of the essays when they came out, I think on BuzzFeed and another platform that I'm not remembering right now. And I've read a couple of them, so far I'm enjoying that. And then the last one is The Collected Schizophrenias by Esme Wei-Jun Wang. And that one, I'm just really interested in mental illness. And I haven't started this one at all, but I hear that she writes about it very beautifully and very intelligently.
Is it a memoir or is it about other people's mental illness?
I think it's a mix of a memoir and also kind of explaining a little bit about mental illness and specifically schizophrenia.
And I think she is schizophrenic.
She is schizophrenic, exactly. Yeah, I have schizophrenia in my family, so it's just an area that I'm very curious about and kind of understanding how people that have to deal with this illness manage it and sort of approach the world and see the world. So I'm excited about it. What about you, Pamela? What are you reading?
Well, I am planning to read this summer 2 books. I don't really know that much about them, but they have gone through the gauntlet of what I think of as like the requirements that a book needs to go through before I will read it, which is to say they've been reviewed, and then the editors who have handled those reviews have also endorsed them. So one of them is in our summer reading roundup. It's called Disappearing Earth by Julia Phillips. This was a book that just got a great review called Superb Debut by Ivy Pacoda in our summer issue. The editor who assigned it, I said, is it really that good? She said, yeah, it's really that good. And the premise of it is one I enjoy, which is like disappeared children, thriller and tragedy, but with the bonus that it takes place in Kamchatka, which is a place that exists to me only on a Risk game board. And therefore, I know nothing else about it other than, it was often the source of my losing that game, which I inevitably always did. So I'm interested in this because it's a thriller, but it's also supposed to be a literary thriller, very well written, more than a thriller. I'm fine with just a thriller, but the fact that it's more than that is intriguing to me. So that is Disappearing Earth by Julia Phillips. And the other book that I plan to read just came out in paperback this week. It's by Craig Brown. 99 Glimpses of Princess Margaret. And what drew me to this, I was not interested in it when it came out, even though our critic Paul Sagal wrote a very positive review. And I think it was one of her best books of the year. And the line that got me was this one. This is the very business of biography, the most sheepish and constrained of the arts, the English journalist and satirist, satire's good, Craig Brown writes in his new book, 99 Glimpses of Princess Margaret. However, his study of the princess, the younger sister of Queen Elizabeth and one of the 20th century's great malcontents, also something I like, is gloriously truant. Brown ignores all the starchy obligations of biography and adopts a form of his own to trap the past and ensnare the reader, even this reader, so determinedly indifferent to the royals. I ripped through the book with the avidity of Margaret attacking her morning vodka and orange juice. So how could you not want to read it? Especially, I am like Parl, I am not interested in the royals, but I just started watching the TV series The Crown with one of my children, with my teenage daughter, and I'm totally enjoying it. I like very much the actress Vanessa Kirby who plays Princess Margaret, and she seems sort of from the beginning like she's going to kind of enliven this joint, if anyone is, meaning like the palace. So I've only just started that, but it definitely piqued my interest in Princess Margaret. So that is 99 Glimpses of Princess Margaret by Craig Brown. And let's just run down the titles again. Jumana, what do you want to read?
I am reading as much of Muriel Sparks' novels as I can get my hands on.
Sarah. I'm reading Say Nothing by Patrick Radden Keefe and When in French by Lauren Collins.
And what are you planning to read, Concepcion?
I'm reading The Dreamers by Karen Thompson Walker, The Good Immigrant, which was edited by Nikesh Shukla and Shemaine Suleiman. I hope I'm saying that correctly. And The Collected Schizophrenias by Esme Wei-Jun Wang.
And I am planning to read Disappearing Earth by Julia Phillips and 99 Glimpses of Princess Margaret by Craig Brown. All right, thanks so much, guys.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, albeit not right away. The Book Review Podcast is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media with the great help of my colleague, John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.